struck down. A federal judge in Massachusetts has blocked the Trump administration from implementing sweeping changes to the childhood vaccine schedule. The ruling also reversing all decisions made by a panel of HHS Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. appointees. In his opinion, the judge says the government ignored the organization's history of involving independent experts in coordinating health policy and that their decision simply wasn't backed by science. Let's bring in former Chief Medical Officer at the CDC, Dr. Deborah Howry, and Jonathan Cohn, Senior National Correspondent at The Bulwark, who has written for decades about the U.S. healthcare system. And Jonathan, let me start with you. Give us some context here. How big of an impact could this ruling have?
Well, it could have a very big impact. You know, for the last year, Kennedy has really run roughshod over vaccine policy in the U.S. You know, he's defunding research, putting out misinformation on the CDC website, getting rid of people like, you know, or pushing out people like Dr. Howry, who might stand up to him and argue for science. With this decision, a judge is basically saying, hey, wait a minute. There are rules in place. There are laws that govern how you make these decisions, and you have violated those rules in two very particular instances that you were mentioned. Number one, by the way he got rid of all the members of this outside advisory committee on vaccines and packed the committee with people who share some or all of his views on vaccines. And then in January, when HHS CDC issued a decision to pull back on the recommendation for a half dozen vaccines, where they didn't even go to that committee and they just made that decision. And the judge is basically saying you can't do that. There's a process in place that requires you to show that you've done some deliberation, you've taken into account the best scientific evidence. You have not done that, so these decisions are not valid.
The administration's already said it's going to appeal. So what's next, Jonathan?
So, I mean, in theory, this could, you know, this was a stay this order, which means it's sort of blocking it. In theory, this, you know, we could play this whole trial out and there could be a finding. If the administration, though, decides to appeal it, it could go up to the higher courts and it could go to to the circuit court, eventually to the Supreme Court. And there are a lot of complex legal issues here involving things like standing, you know, who has standing to bring a lawsuit like this? What is the authority of the HHS secretary? How much discretion do they have? How much do they really have to listen to this committee, and what do these actions qualify as final agency actions? I mean, it gets pretty technical, although these are important issues. So you can imagine a world certainly where this decision gets overturned or partially or in whole, but it does depend on where the administration wants to press it. And politically, this does get into a difficult spot for them because we've all seen this now, they have been trying to pull back on the vaccine stuff, at least publicly, because they're starting to realize it's really unpopular. Most people like vaccines, and we see these headlines about measles outbreaks. We hear about all the traditional scientists being sidelined, and that's not popular.
And Dr. Howry, we need vaccines. These save lives, countless lives. The judge has argued that the government sidestepped the CDC's vaccine advisory panel, which for decades has decided how vaccine recommendations are made. And typically it's the, best experts in the country that are helping to inform some of these decisions. The judge called the move a, quote, strong indication of something more fundamentally problematic, an abandonment of the technical knowledge and expertise embodied by that committee. What did that mean for you, and how are you looking at this new ruling?
Well, honestly, I'm just pleased for the children in our country, because you look at the increase we've seen in flu deaths and measles deaths, whooping cough deaths, and changes in access to vaccines would impact that. For me, this was validating in that we had raised, myself and my colleagues who had left, concerns about the secretary not following the president's executive order around radical transparency and gold standard science. And when you fire experts and bring in people who don't have the qualifications, and you don't follow scientific review and put out ideological decisions, there's an impact that isn't good for America.
Jonathan, we've seen states form different types of healthcare alliances, issuing their own recommendations in light of RFK Jr.'s choices over the past year. What have we seen come of this now patchwork system across the country?
Well, you do have states, obviously, that are stepping up. California, Massachusetts, a bunch of them are saying, hey, we need to step up because people can't trust the CDC anymore. They can't trust federal authorities. But, that's not an ideal situation. First of all, there's a reason we have national standards for these things, among other things. Measles or hepatitis, any of these, infectious diseases, they don't exactly recognize state borders, right? But in addition to that, you have states where they are pulling back. I mean, you look at a state like Florida, where right now there is an ongoing effort from the DeSantis administration to pull back on the childhood vaccine recommendations. And, and as it happens, where do we have a measles outbreak right now? But in Southwest Florida, among people who were not vaccinated. So, we are seeing the medical groups step up. We're seeing the state stand up, and that's good for, that helps, but it's not going to make up for what the CDC used to provide and what we are losing.
Dr. Howery, already we've seen some of the impacts President Trump and Secretary Kennedy have had on health, from the measles uptick to this new study in The Lancet that finds ER orders for Tylenol went down 10% after President Trump falsely said it could increase babies' risk of autism. What kind of damage has already been done, and what would it take to fix it?
Yeah, my concern is the damage that is done. And when you think about vaccine hesitancy, when you start to question things and have statistics that aren't valid or promote, information that isn't based on reality, people, if they hear it from a person of authority like the secretary, might believe it. And it has consequences and costs. We've seen this with the worst measles outbreak in 30 years. We've seen it with whooping cough in Louisiana. These are vaccine preventable diseases. I'm really concerned, too, with what's going to happen after this year with the children that recovered from measles. We've seen many can get encephalitis later on, or brain damage, and they can have their immune system wiped out. So this is not harmless.
I'm so glad you bring up those long-term consequences as well. It's important for parents to know all about that. Dr. Deborah Howery and Jonathan Cohn, I appreciate the conversation. Thanks to you both.